My name is Michael Salady. I have the privilege of being the moderator, so I'll be calling on you, pointing at you, laughing at you periodically. And our special guest of honor, Howard Chaykin, who I know very little about, but I've learned an amazing amount in the last hour. And I am absolutely fascinated, and I am certain that all of you will be, because you are here because you love him, right?
Most of them are here because they love shit that I did 40 years ago. That's why they're here.
So,
How's that?
excellent.
It's the truth. But please, Michael, go on. I didn't mean to interrupt. I'm sorry. I'm actually trying to behave. I really am. But remember what Yoda said about trying, right? Yoda said, trying bullshit is. So please go on.
Howard and I were chatting earlier, and one of the things that we have in common is our love of A, jazz, and B, musical theater. And since, why don't we start with that? Go with it. What do you love about musical theater?
I was 12 years old, and I saw my first show in 1963. It was either Kismet starring Alfred Drake or Carousel starring John Reid at the old Lincoln Center, the New York State Theater in Lincoln Center. And I was in the nosebleeds with my godmother, who was basically raising me while my parents were busy beating the living shit out of each other. And I was utterly transformed. It is one of the transformative experiences of my life, along with reading Edgar Rice Burroughs the day before I was bar mitzvahed. And since that day, I have been available in a very strong way, in a very real way, for live musical theater. I once, in a less dangerously culturally appropriated age, I once described myself as my Indian name was the heterosexual guy who knew absolutely nothing about sports, but far too much than he should about musical theater. I am deeply invested in it as a scholarship, as a fan, and anecdotally, about whenever Tim Burton was making Sweeney Todd in England. By the way, I loathe movie musicals. I absolutely despise movie musicals, with the exception of 3 movies. I'll tell you about those later. I was sitting I was at a convention in Bristol. I was on my way to a week in Paris, and I spent the night in London at a hotel I could no longer afford. And my room wasn't ready. And at the counter was the woman who just recently had ceased to run Disney, who I'd known when she was a development person. And sitting next to me, much as Michael is now, was Stephen Sondheim, who was just basically with a notebook in front of him. He was apparently in the city working with Tim Burton. By a show of hands, does anyone know about Stephen Sondheim's background? Okay, so you'll get this joke. Those of you, you'll explain to them later. I was like, I had one of those moments, okay. And I turned to him and I said, Mr. Sondheim, my name is Howard Chaykin. I'm a cartoonist in some Review and some Renown. It's a quote. And I said, and whereas many of my colleagues are deeply influenced by professional wrestling, I am deeply, deeply influenced by musical theater, and I hate my mother too. And they got it, okay. And I got a laugh out of Sondheim. I was like, what the fuck? This is, my work is deeply informed by the idea of musical theater, both in terms of its choreography, its presentation, its melodrama, and also its sensuality. Years ago, I've been married a lot. I married early and often, like Democrats in Chicago. And I saw it, when Bob Fosse was very upset when Michael Bennett did a chorus line, because he felt he should have done it first. Whether he had the idea first or not is irrelevant. But Fosse's follow-up and attempt to compete with Michael Bennett's chorus line was a show called Dancing, which was his reinterpretation of some great work done previously. And I'm sitting when I go to the theater, I sit in the front row mezz all the time. I always have. It's where I like to sit. My wife and I were sitting there. I was married to a woman that was the smartest woman I'd ever known in my life. Sanguine, hostile, and just really nasty. And we're sitting there, and he was doing a reinterpretation of Agnes de Mille's work on the Copeland the Copeland rodeo. Okay. God, I remember. I'm getting pretty digressive here. This science fiction show. And all these guys were just doing these fabulous leaps and doing that Mikhail Baryshnikov moment of Frozen in the Air. And I turned to my wife and I said, holy fuck, this is a Gil Kane comic book on stage. and it was really true. It really was. And she said, yeah, it's true. So yeah, the two worlds do interact enormously. And as I said to Michael earlier, two of the greatest influences of my life as a writer are Fritz Leiber, whose work on Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser informs almost everything I know and think about friendship, because as I know secretly, those stories really take place in the Bowery in 1938 between two hapless drunks stumbling down under the 3rd Avenue well, wondering when Lost Weekend's coming out. And the other is Frank Lesser, who wrote Guys and Dolls, How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying, and most perfectly, Most Happy Fella. I'm the most happy fella in the whole Napa Valley. I can do this. So yeah, musical theater and jazz. When I was a kid, my first job was working for Gil Kane, who was a progressive jazz fan. He was born in 26. And he worked for a guy named Julie Schwartz, who was a moldy fig. And Julie was very much a vision. Julie grudgingly accepted the presence of saxophones in jazz bands. That's how moldy fig he was. And Gil was a Stan Kenton guy who late in life I finally beat the shit into. You've got to accept the fact that Duke Ellington was God. You know, so what I said. And Gil always said that, well, he was. Come on, man. Let's face it. As I walk down the street, you know. So, Gil was a guy who always insisted, and I didn't understand at the time, how much of the work of him and his contemporaries, the guys who were born in the mid-20s, who basically drew comic books when they were 14 years old as kids, because the almighty guys were getting killed in the Pacific and in Europe, were deeply influenced by big bands. And I didn't see what he was talking about until I reached a kind of maturity in my 30s, and I recognized and understood where he was coming from. Anecdotally, I told a story a couple of days ago on Facebook about working for Gil when I was utterly inept and talent-free. I was 19, and this was in the days before VHS. Those of you who are under the age of 50 have no idea what I'm talking about, but trust me, there was a time. And he said, we're not working this afternoon. I said, okay. And, because basically I was wanking off, I wasn't really doing anything. We watched CoverGirl, a movie with a 1940s musical with Gene Kelly, Rita Hayworth, and Phil Silvers, which we watched, all cartoonists in those days, all guys of that generation of mine. We all had these 9-inch black and white yellow Panasonic portables bolted to our drawing tables. All of us. Every studio had one of those. And we sat and watched this movie, and Gil annotated the movie for me for 2.5 hours. And I got an understanding, very viscerally, of how much the work of a guy like Gene Kelly, who he identified as an urban cavalier in dance, informed the work he did, and then ultimately informed mine. So, there you go. Does that answer your question?
That's a good start.
I think so.
That's a good start.
I'm okay with this. Go on. Moderate, fella.
I'm trying to.
Well, what do we say about Yoda? Trying bullshit is? We go with that one right now? Take it away.
How did that form your work? What inspired you from that, and what came from that inspiration?
I'm a city kid. All the guys of the generation that preceded mine, the guys who came of age in the 40s and 50s, were all Jews, with a couple of Italians and a couple of anti-Semitic Polish guys. My generation was all white trash. I was the only Jew. There were a couple of Jewish writers, but artists, and most of the writers in comics in those days were failed artists, so fuck them. And I had this strong identification with Brooklyn and with Manhattan, with the boroughs. And that said, I live in a small town in California now, but believe me, I'm still that little fucker from Brownsville. And when I realized that Gil was exactly the same person as I was, born 25 years earlier, that he also was this utter Jewish kid from Brooklyn who had reinvented himself as a New Yorker cartoon, I could do the same. And ultimately, following the track of Gene Kelly into his parody of swordplay movies, which is his version of The Three Musketeers, made in 1948, produced by Vander Berman, directed by Louis Milestone, starring Gene Kelly as D'Artagnan, June Allison, the execrable June Allison, as Constance, Lana Turner as Lady de Winter, the Queen was played by Angela Lansbury, the King was played by Frank Morgan, and the Musketeers were Gig Young, Robert Coote, and Van Heflin. I can rattle this shit off like, like nobody's business. I can barely remember what I ate an hour ago, but I'm gonna do it. And there's a sequence in the film where D'Artagnan challenges all three musketeers to fight in the garden, the ruined garden. And he dances the fight. He's just fabulous. And he locks arms with one of the Cardinal Richelieu's men and rolls over his back. He's like, I can do that. I can draw that. I can choreograph that. I can make that work on a comic book page. And I did. And to this day, one of the tropes, one of the attacks that my work frequently suffers is that all my heroes look alike, like it's an accident. Like, oh, I didn't notice that. My heroes all look alike because that's how I chose to draw them. I made a conscious decision to cast the same guy in everything I've done. Nobody seems to notice the fact that this hero, who looks exactly alike each time, is surrounded by a swarm of other-looking characters who were deeply informed by the work that Frank Capra did, by the work that Preston Sturges did, that all these guys, all those Warners and MGM and Paramount contract players, deeply inform how I populate the work that I do. Okay. My hero, to paraphrase Neil Simon, is a version of Think Yiddish, Go British. You know, it's always a guy, it's a guy who looks like the illegitimate son of William Holden, Henry Fonda, and James Garner. That's who my hero is. That's who he is. That's what my guys look like. Those are the guys. But they're motivated and activated by Yiddishkeit, by a sensibility that derives from Middle American, Middle European, Middle Century, Jewish New York sensibilities. As Garrison Keillor says, everybody in New York is Jewish even if you're not, and every Jew in Minnesota isn't even if you are. And that's sort of the sensibility I carry around with me. I mean, I sound like a mid-Atlantic guy. I'm obviously from New York City because of the rapidity and pace at which I speak, but I will explain to you that when I was 13 years old, 2 days after I read Get Rice Burroughs for the first time, I was bar mitzvah. And I had German measles. My mother was convinced they were high. My mother was a moron, I might add. Not a good person. And I did my bar mitzvah. I had 103 fever. I was sick as shit. And I had to be carried home. And I was hallucinating for most of it. And I spent the week watching the Warner Brothers gangsters comedies. Warner Brothers, after Little Caesar and Public Enemy and all the crime pictures they did with these guys, they used the same sets, the same casts, to do comedies about gangsters. Brother Orchid, City for Conquest, All Through the Night, just all this stuff. And I realized that in the movies, everybody was supposed to be stupid, sounded like me. I made a conscious decision not to sound that way, which was a terrible mistake. Because I would much rather, to quote that moron George Bush, be misunderestimated. So that was that. But my work is deeply informed by growing up on the streets of Brooklyn, in New York City. You know, this being the last week was the 54th anniversary of the murder of John F. Kennedy. And I remember being in class, being in assembly, leaving school, and buying Spider-Man #9. And that's what I identify with that. So I fell in love with comic books when I was 4 years old. And I can still drag out without any effort the sense memory of the smell of those mildewed paper from when I was 4 years old. And at 4, I knew that someone made these things. And I wanted to be that person. I had no talent. I had nothing going for me other than blind rage and enjoyed desire. And that desire and rage informed the next 30 years of my life. Until I got good. And then I got good. And now I'm good. I have been for 40 years. Yours?
Fritz Heider.
What about him?
What do you find fascinating about him?
When I discovered, A, that he did not create the Master of the Pfeffer, that he stole them from someone else. Did you know that?
No.
Someone else created the characters.
Cool.
From one note, one to weird tales, I forget them. It's true. I'm not kidding. Not a joke. And that he based them on his ramblings in the Bowery with Stanley Weinbaum. That Weinbaum was the master. Leiber was Pfeffer. And that they were just hapless drunks underneath the 3rd Avenue L. Lankmar is New York in 1938. Okay? It's the Lower East Side. And I just love the idea. When I realized this halfway through reading the one novel about the city of rats underneath Lankmar. And I love this work. I When I discovered Burroughs on October the 20th of 1963, it was that one of those other transformative experiences. It is the third leg of my career. Drawing Nazi planes bombing my Hebrew school homework and playing with army men. And the addition of Edgar Rice Burroughs gives me the three things that make me who I am professionally today. I might add, I can no longer read Burroughs. I tried to read it recently, and it was like, oh my God, this is execrable. Okay. But it introduced me to Robert E. Howard and all the imitators of Burroughs. You know, Otis Adelbert Klein, Fritz Leiber, all these guys, Moorcock, you know, all these guys. And the Leiber stuff stuck because it was literary and funny, because none of these guys had an ounce of sense of humor. I mean, Howard was so obviously completely consumed with mother love that he was if he hadn't killed himself, somebody was going to kill him. And you know, and just Lovecraft, I don't get it. I'm sorry, I'm not that guy. But Leiber was just so funny and clever, and obviously an atheist, which I really embraced as well, because that's something I came to pretty early on as well. I mean, the story of Fafford becoming an acolyte of a faith in which he was racked. I mean, it still cracks me up when I think about that shit. And Leiber deeply informs a book that I did. First of all, the first comic book feature that I did was a miserable adaptation of the stuff that I did for DC Comics. And years later, I was able to apologize by adapting them as a writer for another artist to draw. And I thought I did a pretty good job with that. But Times Squared, which is my favorite work of all the work I've ever done, is basically my version of Fafford and the Grey Mouser. If you accept that Fafford and the Grey Mouser is a sword and sorcery book that takes place in a fantastical sword and sorcery influenced New York City, Times Squared is a crime noir it's a crime noir for people. It's a sword and sorcery comic book for people who like crime fiction. It's that sort of thing. Those of you who have not seen Times Squared, the book came out. I did 2 volumes of it in the mid-'80s. It tanked. Nobody liked it. It was structured along the lines of a Charlie Parker solo twice, and it confused the living shit out of the audience, who were basically much more interested in linear material that patronized and pandered to their own needs and tastes. I'm not that guy. I've always taken advantage of a momentary blip in my popularity to basically do whatever I wanted, allowing the chips to fall where I may. Not because I'm all that brave, or because I want to annoy, but because I'm bereft of filter, and I'm interested in other stuff. I don't necessarily share the sensibilities of my audience. I wish to Christ I like Batman as much as all these guys do. I don't really care. You know, Batman is a rich guy who had a bad day when he was 8. And basically, that's it. You know, these are 15-year-old boys' concepts of adult behavior, drawn and illustrated by 50-year-old men who wish they were still 15. I'm not that guy. You know, I said to Michael earlier that one of the reasons I find Star Wars so reprehensible is that it completely and totally infantilizes the romantic sexual experience of adults. It disavows the existence of romance, except from a 13-year-old boy's perspective. When Han Solo and that woman are talking, Leia, whatever it is, in that movie, the new one, the next back new one, our son, it's like, give me more expository dialogue, please. Would you mind naming the little fucker? You know, come on. My grandsons love it, but they're 6 and 8. You know, my wife and I both regretted not bringing iPods with us. Back to you. Sorry. As Super Chicken said to Fred, you knew the job was dangerous when you took it. You know? It's true.
And now, a new subject area, Super Chicken. We've discussed him before.
Well, when you find yourself in danger, when you're threatened by a stranger, when it looks like you will take a licking, when there's no one else to turn to, there is something you should learn to call for Super Chicken. There's more. If you're really good, I'll finish it at the end of the show. But please, you're wrong. This isn't what you signed up for, is it, pal?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, good. Just go with God, my son.
Let's talk about jazz.
Okay.
Anything you currently like?
Of moderns or the guys who aren't dead?
Yeah.
I only listen to guys who are dead. Seriously, I only listen to guys who are dead. I despise the contemporary audience. I loathe modern venues. It's what drove me away from rock and roll. I hate the idea of people who go to rock and roll shows thinking they're part of the venue. Shut up and sit down. I don't like people who clapping along. Cut that shit out. You're interfering with my experience. You know, I go to the theater a great deal, and these days everything gets an SO. Everything gets a standing ovation. It diminishes the actual quality of excellence. Okay? It's like, no, everything's not that good. You know, it's like praising mediocre food. Just eat it, shut up. You know? So no. So I don't go to live venues. I loathe the audience. I'm not fond of people particularly. They don't like me all that much either. Right now, what's on my player is some Zoot Sim stuff from 1954 to 56. I'm a big Lestorian. I love Lester Young. I feel that Lester Young and Charlie Parker are you know, a heroin addict and a speed freak who just happen to know each other. And not literally, but that's what their music is to me. And I like Zoot Sims a lot. Some months back I did a podcast with Adam Beechin, whose uncle is David Frischberg. We had a long conversation off mic about Frischberg. I love Frischberg. And that whole slew of Frischberg, Bob Dorough, Blossom Dearie, those cabaret singers. When I was a little boy, my parents had friends who had older kids, and they were all these ripple-soled young hipsters, and they would plant me with a stack of cigarette lighters, table lighters, without flint, so I could play with them, like just in preparation for my life as a pyromaniac. And plant me in front of a radio, a stand-up radio, and they'd have dinner, and I'd listen to Symphony Sid. Symphony Sid told them was this disc jockey in New York. He did air checks. He was the source of a song by Lester Young, "Jumping with my boy Sid in the city," who got himself into trouble and became a Latin DJ in the 60s who spoke no Spanish. But he did everything phonetically. Es su hermano, Symphony Sid. Love this guy. Love this guy. So most of what I listen to is, of late, I just recently realized how much I like Donald Byrd. I've been listening to all his sidemen, and I've just gotten into that stuff. A lot of late 40s bop, and a lot of piano. Bill Evans, Dodo Marmarosa, real obscurantists.
Saxophones, yes or no?
Lester Young, Charlie Parker, Don Byas, Coleman Hawkins, yes. Yes. Yes.
Yeah. One of the topics we talked about, we hit on science fiction theater.
Yeah. Truman Bradley. Truman Bradley? All the other old guys. It's like Truman Bradley. Imagine a guy who looks sort of like Ed Muskie. Okay. Ed Muskie? Okay, good. Sitting at his desk like this with a Tesla coil over here and a centrifuge over here. And he would introduce this miserably produced, shittily directed and acted 20-minute play on science fiction theater. And I hated it. Because science fiction to me is space opera. And I wanted ray guns, I wanted really cool outfits, I want all this other stuff. And now, of course, the inverse is true. I miss Truman Bradley in science fiction theater. I hate space opera, I truly do. I loved it so much for so long, and the vacuity of it finally caught up with me, I guess, in my late 40s. And I'm old, I'm in my late 60s now, so it's been sitting in my gut for 20 years now. But my cousin would want to watch it with me, and I in my head I can still see it in this kinescope perspective on my head. Truman Bradley. The fact that I can pull that out of my memory shames me, like I have nothing better to do with my fucking brain than remember Truman Bradley. You were saying?
Yes, actually I was saying. We talked about Truman Bradley, we talked about science fiction theater.
Yeah, I mean, what startled us was my indifference to science fiction, which is where we're going here. I owe my career to SF. I really do, because I loved it as a child. When I discovered Edgar Rice Burroughs at the age of 12, it changed my life. It really did. It was just, I felt as if I had been handed the key to the kingdom. My second or third wife. So. And I love this stuff. I read all of Heinlein. I read all of the 20th century great men, you know, some critically and some uncritically. But when I became a comic book artist in the late 70s, I was confronted with a guy who didn't much like SF as an editor, who weaned me away from it. I still had held on to a lot of material, but he started showing me crime fiction. He introduced me to Dashiell Hammett, Raymond Chandler, James M. Cain, Paul Kane, and ultimately, this woman I was married to, this woman who made the Gil Kane stuff when we were seeing Dancing, the smartest and best read woman I'd ever known. And she said, you know, I don't care what you read, but I can't read this anymore because it's only about itself. And I started thinking about that, and it sort of stuck. So, you know, I will occasionally dip my toe into the material, but the last contemporary guy I read, as I told Michael, was S.M. Sterling and the Draka stories. And I read them not realizing where his politics were. I didn't get I read them as cautionary tales as opposed to a training manual. And I gather they do reflect his sensibility. I can't say for sure, but that's the impression I get. But, so I owe my career to this material, but it's no longer a part of my life. I've moved on. I feel that way about rock and roll as well. I can't listen to rock and roll anymore. I mean, one of the reasons that men of our generation moved away from rock and roll when we did, and many of us went to country western music, because it was talking about issues and ideas that were growing older with us. And rock and roll is still about an adolescent's idea. I mean, I read a review yesterday of this biography of John Brenner, and I actually felt bad for him, you know, for going so utterly corporate at Rolling Stone. I started reading Rolling Stone when I was 20, you know, but it holds a very strong place in my heart. But I've moved on from that world. I'm deeply grateful for its existence because it gave me a language and a venue to function in. And I still sort of tag it, but I'm so much more interested in historical material, in crime fiction, in erotica, in absolute filth. And I mean, the most recent book is called The Divided States of Hysteria. If you look at the bio the public convention published about me, I died in 2006. I've been working pretty steadily since then. The new book is called The Divided States of Hysteria, and it takes place in a world in which the next successful terrorist attack in the United States is basically taken out of a major American city. The hero is the guy who misidentifies the target, gets everybody killed, his wife, his children, and his girlfriend, because he's morally challenged. My heroes tend not to be Boy Scouts. They're complex guys. And he loses everything. And he hires on with a Blackwater type company to seek out and murder the people who are responsible for this, and then inadvertently discovers that they're planning another one because, as it turns out, he was right where he was identifying the target, but the engine of the event made an executive decision in the middle of it, so they're not quite completed with their mission. And this book has generated enormous hostility for me this past summer. The equanimity that I spent in the year 2017, despite the slow motion apocalypse that we're living in right now, was exacerbated by the fact that I was getting slammed in the head by my side of the aisle. I might add that I'm a very left Democrat, being accused of Islamophobia, racism, bigotry, anti-Semitism, sexism, and just basically of being accused of being a fat old white man. And the only good thing about it is that I'm sort of stuck in the middle now because the right is so reprehensible. I can't see myself shifting in that direction. I want to have a chat with David Mamet and see how it's feeling right now for him, okay, having made that adjustment. So that's what I'm working on now, or it's what I finished working on right now. So the work I do tends to be a reflection of my point of view. I don't have a great deal of empathy with the concept of superheroes. Whenever I do them, my editors always give me shit because I don't use their powers enough. And I just don't, please, shit come out of your eyes? Okay, well, good, guys, now back to something more interesting. I just don't care about that sort of thing. Years ago, I was at a convention with Sergio Aragonés, and Sergio and I were sitting listening to people talk about Cocoon, that movie with Don Amici and all the other old actors. And both of us I hated the movie. I truly hated the movie. Not because of anything other than the fact that it said that we were entitled to have someone come from the outside and save us, which I fucking hate. I truly loathe the idea. As Walt Kelly says, we had met the enemy and he is us. And I actively have an aversion to the idea of a ghost in the machine coming to rescue me from the problems I've created. It's my job to solve the problem. And it's why I don't like superhero comic books. I do them when occasionally offered because frankly they're a cheap paycheck and they pay me well. And I can do them okay. I'm a journeyman when it comes to that sort of material. But I like doing stories about people who, when they die, they stay dead. And that I'm not participating in a manipulation of a fatuous audience. And I tend to give my audience more credit than it deserves. I overestimate my audience. But occasionally something filters through. I told the story on Facebook this past couple of weeks about running into somebody at a convention in Durham who had rather abashedly, I think he was afraid he was going to get hit, told me that he had participated in making sure that his comic book store did not carry this book I just told you about, Divided States. And I said, so you read the book and didn't like it? He said, no, I haven't read it. And that's what we're talking about here. That reaction is exactly mine. I said, this is not the country I was born in. This interviewer I told you some months back asked me whether there was anything I was outraged by. And I said, no. I'm occasionally contemptuous, but never outraged. Is that for me?
Yes,
is there money in there? Is there power?
It's your special sticker.
Oh, please. You want to be yours? I don't feel all that special. It's like the Olympics, you mean? No?
Put it on your badge, and then everyone knows you're special.
I really do. All right, I'm just going to go. Put it in here, and I will consider your option. Okay.
Use it or not.
I will. Okay. Thank you. Your name is?
I'm Gwen.
Hi, Gwen. Nice to see you. Okay,
Nice to meet you in person.
It's not that big a deal. Thanks. For me, I'm not that special. Like that's why it's in here.
I am though.
You're special?
Yes.
Okay, cool. That's great. I feel better already.
Excellent.
Thank you. I just feel like we're responsible, and it's our job to save shit. Years ago, my first Hollywood job, I wrote a movie that had been written. I was working on the 12th draft. I think there had been 15 since. The franchise of which was Dirty Harry. I'm going to use air quotes now. I never use air quotes. It's an appalling habit. But Dirty Harry and James Bond were both working for the same intelligence agency, and they both thought the other one gone rogue, but it turned out they were both wrong. And they teamed up in the end of the second act to fight the guy who did it. Okay. It was like a $75,000 scholarship to film writing school. It was a terrible script. I did a shitty job of it. It was just awful. And I delivered it. And the two producers were two guys who were major players in Hollywood at the time. And individually, separately of each other, they had no contact with each other. Their first note in each case was, is there any way the heroes could be more altruistic? Which I found fascinating. To these two criminals, who were basically criminals who they didn't have the guts to carry a gun, wanted me to basically posit heroes who were more altruistic. Because it was unnecessary for them to be honest, because they were producing material that fed the lie of morality to an audience that was fatuous. So I try not to participate in that. I fail, as Yoda says, trying bullshit is, but every so often I succeed. And the problem for me is that when I do succeed, I antagonize an audience that is desperately needs to have its beliefs confirmed. And I prefer to be surprised and dismayed rather than have my feelings confirmed. I'll try anything once, which has gotten me through a lot of shit over the past 67 years, but I'm still here. You're welcome.
What's next?
I can't say because it's in development right now, but I'm really excited about it. It's a raging pain in the ass. It's a very difficult book. I'm taking on something that I've never done before, something structurally very different from anything I've ever done, that takes place at 4 different eras simultaneously, so it's going to be 4 levels of reference. You missing this? And it's going to be really difficult to do, and it's going to be difficult to make dramatic for an audience that is sort of inured to a genuine emotional drama. It's not going to be science fiction. It's going to be real world stuff. It's going to be a Roman à clef. And I'm scared, but I prefer challenges to insipid. I've also I've completed a series for Dark Horse Comics called Sunshine Patriots, which we're still trying to figure out how to publish. which is about a Western, a quasi-Western. It's about two veterans of Roosevelt's Rough Riders. I'm a big fan of how the United States was invented. You know, I believe the United States was invented with, you know, the money that was made from, the corrupt money that was made in the American Civil War by the guys who sold shoddy crap to the Union Army, which were then invested in railroads and communications, and those guys became the robber barons who basically created the 20th century. I mean, modern America started around 1911. That's really where it started for me. And two guys who were members of Roosevelt's Rough Riders, who 10 years later find themselves down in their luck, living in Los Angeles, and become hired guns working for a Hollywood studio to defend against the onslaught of the first wave of the Sicilian Mafia. And the Mafia is being financed by Emperor Maximilian of Mexico. So it's fucked up. But it's a quasi-Western that takes place in Los Angeles, and it's also, to tell you the truth, in an odd sort of way, deeply influenced by the adventures of Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser. Because the two heroes, one is based on Big Bill Haywood. Big Bill Haywood? Nobody. Okay. Big Bill Haywood was a union organizer in the late 19th and early 20th century. He was murdered along with Joe Hill. He was something called the Industrial Workers of the World, which was known as the Big Union, which was an attempt to organize all workers around the world, the Internationale. You know, before Marxism had been utterly, you know, betrayed by those cocksuckers like Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin. You know, I come from, that's my family. I'm a popular front kid. The earliest photograph of a member of my family is my uncle when he's 13 getting punched in the face by a cop. So that's where I come from. He's the Fafhrd character. His name is Big Bob Hitler. And the Mouser character is a guy named Appomattox Benjamin, who is the child of freed slaves who had been owned by Judah Benjamin, the Secretary of the Treasury of the Confederacy, who is black and speaks really good Yiddish, which is a plot point in the story. And it's about show business. I love this story, and I'm hoping Christ we can get it out there before it just disappears in a way. See, I guess to some people I feel like a player in comic books, but I'm very much a man among men and a worker among workers in my field. I'm not held in any particular high regard. For example, I have aged out of Marvel Comics, and I have aged out of DC Comics, which is why I can be completely sanguine about my feelings about their product. No one's going to give me a job at DC or Marvel. I'm just not the guy they want. And I plan to die at my desk. So I've got to create product to do. That's what I do.
What do you think about current affairs?
The modern world?
Yeah, the modern world.
Oh, get out of town, babe. You think seriously? You would ask such a question at a science fiction convention?
Yeah.
I mean, what are the tropes? What are the incorrect beliefs among civilians about the world of popular culture? Is that we're all a bunch of wild and crazy guys. And the truth is that the most conservative socially in our culture are comic book readers and science fiction readers. They tend to be, if not politically conservative, very socially conservative. They have eccentricities that seem to betray that social conservatism. But the social conservatism is the defining nature of the product. One of the things that's going on right now in comics is the recognition of the chasing of the diversity market, that the diversity market is actually 3 guys in a room with a megaphone, and that the real market is actually a 50-year-old man who voted for Trump. Okay. Marvel's readers are more conservative than the rest of the market because they're older guys. They've been reading this stuff since they were 13. And that's sort of the way it is. I spent all of 2016 in the Midwest. I traveled to the Midwest. So I live in Ventura, which is known as, by its inhabitants as Ventucky, the hillbilly city by the sea, San Bernardino by the bay. You know, so we're a redneck town, okay? So after the experience I had living in, visiting the Midwest, I was there at least once a month. I was in Minnesota, I was in Michigan, I was in Illinois, I was in Ohio and Indiana. I came home, and I was not surprised by the results of the election. I was shocked, I was dismayed, but I was not surprised. And I also grew up with this guy in my world. In the last issue of Divided States, I wrote a series of essays for each one because I have a big mouth. And the last essay was about why we tell unpleasant stories and where do we go from here. And I pointed out my antipathy for horror stories. I'm a big baby. I don't like horror stories. I can't bear it. I mean, when It was the big movie of the year, when it was all over the place, I was like, scary clowns. Not for me. I'm not that guy. But I definitely like political horror. And I feel like I'm living in a YA dystopian novel that I wasn't planning on reading. That's the world in which I live. Tell me I'm wrong. Come on, kids, let's go. Deny me I'm wrong. And the other answer is, where do we go from here? And my answer was nowhere. Certainly not in my lifetime. As I said, I'm 67 years old. I had dinner with my family yesterday, my daughter, my son, and the 4 grandchildren. And I recognize that this is it. This is the new normal. And I'm afflicted with memory. Those of us who are old enough, who wrote it down, recall that the America they woke up in this morning is not the America they woke up in when they were kids. It's a different country. And it's true on both sides. As I said, the only thing that's keeping me from being shoved to the right by the overt hostility of the slivers of identity politics that identifies its own needs as the paramount is the utter reprehensible nature of the fact that the right has become the National Socialists of America. I once described my career as being too mainstream for the weird and too weird for the mainstream, and that pretty much plays it's true. I'm held in utter contempt by the art school comics guys, the museum people, because they do mainstream work. But the mainstream looks at my shit and is like, what the fuck is he talking about? So I'm kind of in the middle. There's a certain freedom to that, but it also means having to fight for certain niches that you're dealing with. And I feel that way about politics right now. I recognize the fact that I'm an extremely left liberal who got into a thread a couple days ago when this woman at 25 was schooling a very old friend of mine who was a combat veteran in Vietnam on PTSD. Because he used the word trigger in a way that she felt was insultingly ironic. What the fuck? My God. We have become a culture of so utterly and completely narcissistic need that the idea of not living in an echo chamber has ceased to be of value. I live in a small town, as I say. I'm a member of a spiritual fellowship, despite the fact that my atheism. And yesterday, I sat there with a friend, just like Michael Simon, who is a rabid right-winger. And I have deep issues with his politics. But because he's my friend, I trust him explicitly. That may be fucked up, but it's how I was raised. So, I live in terror. I spent the 1950s assuming I would wake up with a pile of glowing ash. Now, I have no fucking thing. I mean, what makes me the craziest, what really drives me the most nuts, is that we seem to be on the edge of a precipice and no one's paying attention. We are not interested in addressing it. And I think that we are an absolutely distracted culture. And it makes me nuts. You have to start, huh?
Yeah, it's my job. It's my job.
All right. Go ahead, you're next. Let's have some fun.
Okay, we'll open it up for questions.
Which is, the night coward.
I know you said that
I did.
Marvel wouldn't hire you again, but if they called you and asked you to do another Star Wars comic, would you?
No.
Why?
Because I regard the work as puerile. I regard the work as requiring too much of this and not enough of It is no interest in me whatsoever. I'm not a whore.
If they said you had free reign, would that change anything?
What I love about you right now more than anything is the fact that you're a romantic fantasist. There is no such thing as free reign in the context of corporate culture. Trust me.
Oh, I
years
know.
ago. Years ago.
I was just saying if.
No, there's no ifs. I mean, if God and Superman had a fight, who'd win? You know, if I were taller and younger than I am now, would you care about me more? Thank you very much. When I was a kid, I obsessed over comic books. I loved comic books. I loved everything about comic books. And Star Wars fits into that universe. And I wanted everybody I knew to love what I loved, because that's what it's all about. Ultimately, they did. And every day, I see some guy who's this gorgeous guy, some chick, some gorgeous woman, who tells me that they were a geek when they were in high school. I know they're lying. I know they're full of shit. But what they're doing is they're identifying with a nascent form of culture. Hollywood is basically the guys used to beat the shit out of us for reading comic books in high school, making money off our fat fucking asses.
Yeah. Yep.
That's what it's all about. And again, God willing, go with God. It's okay. That's what happens. That's life. When I hear geek culture, nerd culture, that's just bullshit. It's culture. It is what it is. Brandon Tartikoff. Brandon Tartikoff?
Yeah.
Okay. Brandon Tartikoff identified comics as the next thing years ago. He was too early, and then he dies. He was too early because he was working for guys who was 10 to 20 years his senior, who couldn't have his vision. They lacked his vision. They couldn't see the material the way he did. And then he drops dead. Okay? Fuck you. Did I say that out loud?
Yes.
I did.
It's hard to know who it was. That's all.
Agora Hills. Fuck, who lives in Agora Hills? I mean, at any rate, now that the material is available, okay, we are riding a swell and wave of the work that we loved as children being absorbed and identified. And what's happened there is that it has been flattened out, okay, and reinvented and redefined to reach a wider audience, okay? Living as they do in a small town. Very few people have any idea what I do for a living, because it's none of their fucking business, okay? I don't really got going around, oh, why, he does comic books, gee, can I pay your children? No, please, let me know. When the first Iron Man picture was trailering in town, these people were losing their shit. None of them had any idea that it existed as a comic book. It didn't have any context for them. It was Robert Downey Jr. in a really cool suit.
Yeah.
They loved the movie. None of that social effect of all of that movie stuff, Guardians of the Galaxy, which I thought was just swell, Justice League, which I thought was just fine and sturdy despite all this nonsense, none of that trickles down to me, or us, the people who make this material. None of it. Neither socially, financially, spiritually, or professionally. It just doesn't happen. They are at a complete remove. Okay? One of the problems with popular culture is that we tend to mistake favorite for best. We tend to think that because we like something, it must be good. You know, said the French. It ain't true. You're entitled to like shit. Just don't think liking it makes it any less shitty. I love pizza. Believe me, I know the pizza is not good. Until recently, I finally broke myself of the habit of whenever I was in an airport anywhere in the world, I'd have a hot dog. I love hot dogs. I know they're made of dog noses. You know, they're disgusting. But you're entitled to like. But don't think that liking something gives it an imprimatur of quality. Okay? When I tell people I'm not fond of the work that I've done in Star Wars, I always have to caveat and explain that you're entitled to love it as much as you like. But don't expect me to congratulate you for it. Sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay? If I were a whore, I would do that Star Wars comic book. But I have self-respect, I have dignity, and I have the courage of my convictions.
What if they asked you to write an original comic?
You're relentless. No, I wouldn't.
Okay.
Someone else. Someone.
Craig.
wait a second. This woman was incredibly patient. You had a hand up before. I'll get to you in a second. Then great. You. Stand up so I can hear you.
All right.
By the way, great hair.
Thank you.
I'm so, you have no idea. I had hair like that. I'm not.
Natural,
The past 10 years,
Yeah.
I went from being Robert Downey Jr. to Ed Asner. But like, no, I had hair like that. Don't even think about it, right?
Thank you.
No, it's the best. Go on.
I don't know if this question will land well, but I was wondering what ideas you've wrestled with that your audience seems to really respond to, and what ideas in your art you wish they had kind of like clued in on.
I wish they'd read the material and judge the material after reading it, as opposed to drawing conclusions based on hearsay and presumption. We are living in a culture that tends to identify the depiction of an act as the act itself. And I find that frightening, because it's a closing of the mind, you know? And I'm one of those guys who rejects entirely the idea that Hitler was crazy, okay? I think Hitler was a politician who saw his franchise. There's a wonderful review of a new biography of Stalin that identifies the three characteristics of Stalin, Hitler, and Mussolini. Mussolini was a hedonist who basically used fascism to get laid. Hitler slept till noon. And Stalin was at his desk at 6 a.m. every morning. And that if Stalin had not died when he did, he would have been basically imposed a murder on the Soviet Union that would make us not care about the Holocaust. Okay? So I think it lets people off easy when you're forced by, when you find yourself biologically incapable of entertaining an idea that is anathema to you. Okay? And I've spent my entire life, when I was working in television, I made a lot of money. I worked on shit I'd never watch, but I made a fortune. It was fabulous. And I was living in California, as I am now. And I subscribed to every magazine I ever wanted. Everything. And that meant way to the right, way to the left. And I read everything. I read The Nation and the National Review at the same time. Okay. My sympathies were with The Nation, but I dropped both subscriptions because I found that I'm required to be preached to, and that I felt the National Review was utterly and completely full of shit, and The Nation was often as well. But I became available to hearing other points of view. And I live in a country that, I believe, left the door open to entertain ideas other than my own. And Eldridge Cleaver said it, too much agreement spoils a chant. Go with God. This dame right here, next to guy, you looking at your phone?
I'm
You got a
reading
question?
your Wikipedia.
Uh-oh.
And you're quoting yourself.
I am. You won't have, well,
No,
you
it's
know.
not your Wikipedia, it's your Facebook page.
Okay. Well, yeah, I've said there's a lot of it's coming out on Facebook over these past couple of
The
weeks.
truth is I've wandered in here. So
Having no idea who I am.
I know who our guest artist of honor was.
Right.
And I could figure out what else was happening at the con because I
See, she's the one I thought was going to be more all of you.
So I believe in green, but I really do miss my pamphlet to know what's going on here.
Right.
So I'm trying to catch
Don't you?
up.
Right.
And I hate putting apps on my phone, and I'm interested in what the United States of this area is now, and the fact that you had a conversation where you didn't want to change minds, and you have a Facebook page. I have all kinds of friends like that. I'll add you as a friend.
Well, I'll
My
remember
name
your
is
name.
Crystal.
Hi, Crystal.
Nice to meet you.
Stop that. You might note I am fairly comfortable in my own skin. Someone else? Craig, you got something?
Well, I wanted to ask you about American Flagg, which I think really exploded you onto the comic book scene.
What was the first thing I did that was any good?
And, you know, I wanted to know the impetus behind it and how you feel it relates to where we are today.
Flagg was a reflection. I mean, I spent 3 years working as a paperback illustrator. I never became any good because I'm not patient enough and I don't have a skill set that commits to patience. I was in great debt and I was made an offer to create a book. I have no idea why this company felt they could do anything of any value, because they never really felt I demonstrated anything of any value. But Flagg was a reflection. I was a drug addict and a drunk, and I was in blind rage about the Reagan administration. I felt the Reagan administration was tearing this country apart. And I was incredibly horny. I was deeply obsessed with transgressive sex. I was 31. You know, come on. Remember, who's 31? Anybody 31 in the room? Okay. Are you crazy? A little bit? No. I was nuts. But it was 1982. In 82, you could be nuts. It was great. It was like, and I wanted to put it all on paper, because as I said, my mentor was a guy named Gil Kane, who said that you can do something that demonstrates a genuinely personally held idea. And I did this. It reflected my obsession with politics, guns, cars, Jean-Paul Gaultier, Giorgio Armani, and lingerie, women's underwear. And it was just all of a piece. And I wanted to do a book that would annoy, piss off, and entertain. And I did. Heavily political, funny, lots of crazy shit, And I also spent 6 months studying other forms of narrative design, because I felt that comics had become staid and boring, and then I was looking at map making, I was looking at cartography, as they say. I was looking at the work of a guy named Richard Saul Werman, who was a great designer. He designed the map for the New York subway system, the London Metro, and he created a series of books about tour books called Access, which exploded the idea of tour guides. It was just an entirely different way of thinking about visiting a city or sports. And I wanted to do a character that reflected my own sensibility. It was the first time I did that Think Yiddish, Go British guy, that Neil Simon guy, with a lot of wordplay, a lot of puns, and an onslaught of advertising. Because there was a show called Dream On a couple of years ago, in which the kid is, and I'm that kid. I was raised in front of a television set. My wife has no context with this. She never watched TV. She never listened to rock and roll. I mean, television is just a huge part. To this day, I watch endless hours of television. I love TV, and I've always loved TV, even when it was just really shitty. And so I wanted to do a comic book about that love of television, and how television is so really pervasive in this world, with a lot of fucking, and just have a book with a great deal of sex, sexy characters having sexy sex with each other, and causing problems because of that. Because the thing about comics is that they are about violence without consequences, and I like consequences. When my characters get beaten up, they get the shit kicked out of them. They don't bounce back. It's not like Frederick Wortham said, Batman has a Band-Aid on his shoulder after having an action sequence with the Joker. It's just, and my characters frequently lose control and have real problems, emotional issues. When I read other characters, other comic books, anecdotally, I can't get epics where I live. So I've only seen the first 3 episodes of a show called Get Shorty, which is loosely based on the material. At the end of the 3rd episode of Get Shorty, Chris O'Dowd, who's an Irish actor, a really lovely man, big, tall, who managed to play that comedy from menace in the stories, he's the hero of the story. He commits an act of moral violence, not physical violence, but violence on a character who is genuinely undeserving of the violence to achieve a goal. And I'm watching this with my wife, and it is an astonishing piece of business. It's quiet, it's over a table. Has anybody seen the show? Okay. You know the scene I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Okay. You remember that moment where he tells the girl what they found in the computer?
Yeah, okay.
And and I was like, holy shit, I wish I'd written that. Because that's my hero. A guy who will do anything to achieve a goal. Okay? That's the sort of thing that the average comic book reader would be repulsed by. Because villains are villains. And good, but they're not. Villains are heroes of their own movie. Okay? Villains are just, they're not villains. Villain is an ironic phrase coined by the British. Okay? My guys, the antagonists in my material, are just as morally upright as my heroes. Sometimes more so. They just happen to be repellent to me. When I see someone twirling a mustache or breathing deeply like James Earl Jones, as Mao said, I reach for my gun. You know, I'm just not that interested in so blindly cliche and atavistic an idea about villainy. Someone else? Cowards. Come on, you big babies. Yes,
Well,
you've been very patient.
following up on the American flag thing,
Sure.
would you ever consider doing another story?
I keep playing with it, I really do,
You
but,
seem like you'd have a lot of material.
oh, I
these days to
do,
work with.
I do. But the problem is, it's no longer as funny. Flagg, are you familiar with the material?
Yes,
Okay,
I read it when it came out.
okay. How old are you?
Oh,
You play young.
I do.
You dye your hair?
Plastic surgery.
Okay. You dye your hair?
No.
You're good. I'm jealous of hair. I'm having a hair jealousy. Okay, you happy now? The hell are you on?
Tell me about it.
What's that? Yeah. Thank you very much, Craig. The problem is, I'm not the same guy I was when I was 31.
Fair enough.
Okay. And I have other concerns and other considerations. And I also know that, like Blazing Saddles, like the work of Richard Pryor, to do it today would be to set my house on fire. Because the audience is so utterly and completely convinced that it has a right to participate in a narrative, that it arrives pre-appalled. Have all of you been, who's seen Justice League? Seen the movie? Who hated Justice League? Okay? Perfectly sturdy, okay movie. Not great, good, okay? I'm convinced that one of the reasons why it's taking such heat is the result of 35 years of video games. In that, when I was in my mid-30s, I was at a comic book convention when the concept of miniseries was first emerging in comics. And I had a guy in the pen raise his hand, and he said, I don't like miniseries because it means I cannot write a letter to the company and in some way impact on the conclusion of the narrative. What? And he was serious, and he was forthright. And I mocked him because I'm unkind. Trust me. But it stayed with me. And I believe that that's a lot of what's going on. It's a form of halo effect. I think one of the reasons why I worked in video games for about 5 years. I consulted on a number of games. And I played them. And I realized that whenever I played a war game, like Call of Duty, whatever it was, all I wanted to do was kill my officers and go home. I didn't want to play the game. I just wanted to friendly fire, blow them out of the water, and go home. Get laid. Whatever. That the idea of participating in the narrative was anathema to me. That I actively wanted to be surprised and delighted by something I'd not seen before. Not to have an impact on the thing. But we now have a culture attuned to the idea of imposing one's judgment on narrative. And I believe that's a lot of what's happening with this material. That you go in with preconceived notions and not having those notions satisfied, because they're impossible to satisfy, because they're yours. They're preconceived. So if I were to do American Flag today, it would get me into so much fucking trouble. Just by the very nature of the visual narrative choices, of the fact that you've got a slew of people fucking like rabbits, indiscriminately, the audience would lose its shit in the bonfire. They'd lose their minds. They would. Because basically, we are entering an age of a quasi-Victorian confusion of an empowered sector of society who also feel the need to be protected, which is so utterly contradictory in its idea that I'm glad I'm old, because I don't want to have to see what this world is going to be like in 15 years. Yes, you got it.
I have a question.
Dive up, stand up, let's go. I need you to stand up because I can't hear you.
Okay, that's fine.
He just likes looking at you.
It's fine as well. What is the place of morality in art, if there is a place?
None. None.
That's an easy answer.
None. I feel that. There's an artist named Ludwig Holheim. Holheim? He was a great advertising artist in Germany in the Weimar Republic. who became one of Hitler's favorite poster artists. And he was astonishing. You can see his influences on the work of anybody from Ronald McLeod to Nancy Stahl to Mark Chiarello. His subject matter was repellent, but he was really good. You know, we're re-examining the work of Robert Crumb now. And I find it astonishing. I truly do. I'm waiting for the pillory. It's coming, you know, but, you know, what the fuck. Someone else? Yes, stand up, please. I need to see you so I can hear
You live in Ventura.
you. I do.
Have you been to the Reagan Library, and if so, what your reaction?
No.
Okay.
The idea is I'm so glad he's dead.
But he's dead there.
Pardon me?
He's dead there, buried there.
Yeah, I know, but
No more
I mean,
reason
look,
not to go.
I also have that, my mother is buried in Napa, but I haven't been there either because I'm afraid she's going to be crawling out of the grave and drag me down. by the fancy tie at my wicked throat, speaking of musical theater references. Thank you very much. But no, there's the political novelist Thomas Mallon. Thomas Mallon? Thank you. His book about the Reagan administration is staggering. It's brilliant, you know. You should read Mallon. Read Dewey Defeats Truman. Read Henry and Clara. No? Okay. Someone else?
Well, I went to the Reagan Library.
Lucky
once.
girl.
A friend of mine, very deeply enamored, fond of Reagan, wanted to go to the library and see it all. And I wanted to go there to make sure he was dead.
I'm there. You know,
And we both achieved our result. It was just fun.
but and that's where the farmer and the cowman should be friends.
Exactly.
Someone else? Come on, you big. Yes, stand up.
As somebody who's done both extensively, how do you compare the experience of writing for somebody else to illustrate your words, either live actors or another comic book artist, as opposed to writing something for yourself to draw?
I write the same thing. When I write for another artist to draw, I deliver a full script. You should understand, I haven't delivered pencil since 1980. When someone hires me to do a job, I'm a brand. I have a certain, if people hire me, they know what they're going to get. You know, within parameters, but they know what they're going to get. So I deliver, when I'm writing for anything, I deliver a full script. I like full script. I despise this Marvel style stuff. It's lazy and it insults the artist. So when I wrote Twilight, I did that with Jose Garcia Lopez, he got full script. Every single panel was deeply described. Not as described as Alan Moore's. If you've ever seen Alan Moore's scripts, Alan Moore's scripts are exhausting. They're just like, oh, kill me now. I mean, and they're brilliant, but I wouldn't want to draw them because they just take too much. By the time I've read them, I don't want to draw them anymore. That's why I so deeply respect Dave Gibbons. So working in television, as I say, I never worked on a show I'd watch, and most of the guys we had working with us were loxes, you know, for the most part. I mean, I worked on what might be arguably the worst television show ever made. It was so bad, it was a TV show in a novel about bad TV. That's how bad this show was, you know. Earth Final Conflict. Oh, yeah, that was like, you have no idea. It was like the most toxic professional experience I've ever had in my life. It was fantastic. Just amazing. I left the office the day before Thanksgiving after being told I was the most disliked person on the staff. Never came back, continued to draw a weekly paycheck. Wrote 3 more episodes, just delivered them, they did whatever they wanted to do with them. And the only reason I was fired, not because I didn't show up in the office, I was drawing my paycheck. The only reason I was counter-fired because one of the producers fired one of the other guys. The guy they fired has never had anything produced in his life. And I went into development with the company. But when I was ultimately fired by the guy for whom I was working, I was told by my spiritual advisor that I had to pray for him. And I said, I pray that he gets ass cancer and a brain tumor. And it eats its way through his fat fuck English Jew body to the meat of the shriveled turd that he uses for a heart. And my spiritual advisor said, that will work for today. So I regard myself as a cartoonist. A cartoonist is someone who writes and draws. That's my definition of it. And I love the process. I just love it. I mean, I'm in development right now on this new book, and it's making me nuts. It really is, because I know, I have a general idea who the heroes are. I haven't quite got how to dramatize it, but it's like, I'm a crossword puzzle guy. I do the New York Times puzzle Thursday through Sunday. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday is bullshit. It's just nuts. Don't waste your time. If you can do that, you can do the TV Guide crossword puzzle. It's all right. So I don't read at night because narrative keeps me working. So crossword puzzles is what I do at night. And much of what I'm doing right now in this new book is the crossword puzzle end of it. It's just like, why are these people doing this? And do I tell this way? Or do I go next? Is it a linear through line? Do I move back and forth in time? How do I conceal future events? It's just stuff. And I'm excited about it. I'm terrified. But, you know, I'm pretty type A. So I will be okay. So, one more question. Yes, Star Wars boy.
If you had to dig deep, deep, deep down to find one positive aspect of working on Star Wars, what would it be? We have time.
Keep digging.
No, I'm willing to, this, I mean, I respect the magnificent obsession. I truly do. I don't share it, but I respect it.
Keep digging.
Not really. No, I mean, I'll anecdotally, I did the book, I sold millions of copies, and I received an additional $15 a page for the reprints. Had the book come out a year later, when the royalties plan was in place in comics, I would have made, for the 6-issue adaptation, between $2 and $3 million. I would also be dead, because my lifestyle at that point involved a great deal of alcohol and a great deal of drugs. And that's called, like, putting fat in the fire, you know what I'm saying? Some years back, I was talking about this with some resentment at a comic book convention, and they compared me to Harrison Ford pissing and moaning about it. I said, well, here's the difference. Harrison Ford was made a multi-millionaire by Star Wars. I was made a multi-$15 a page here. So go fuck yourself. Okay. So, no, there really isn't. There's no positive to it. Poisons my career. It is the toxic waste on my career, because for the most part, if you look at the metrics of comics, and this will be a long answer to a short question, the metrics of comics is that there are 250,000 people in the United States buying all the comic books we make. That's it, 250,000. And out of that 250,000, maybe 30,000 at the very most know me as anything other than the guy who did Star Wars. They don't know about American Flagg, or Times Square, or The Shadow, or Black Hole, or Black Kiss, or the Divided States of Hysteria, or Midnight of the Soul, or Satellite Sam, anything. Only Star Wars. Because, from my perspective on this side of the table, I am the brand. But the companies have a vested interest in convincing you that the material, who's coming next? What's next?
This is the
Show me the thing.
Oh, yes.
Can I see?
You can see the full description and everything.
Oh, cool. I like libraries. I like librarians. Okay.
Yeah, it's a really interesting panel.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
The companies have a vested interest in convincing you that the material is the brand. That it doesn't matter who's doing it, it's what it is. And that's just bullshit. It's nonsense. A badly drawn Wolverine, a badly written Wolverine story is not as good as a well-drawn, well-written Wolverine story. It's still the same Wolverine. And the same is with Star Wars, okay? People love the work I did, but it's terrible work. It's really hack work. I'd like to think if I noticed it was going to be this big a deal, I would have done a better job. I'd drawn the first 3 issues by the time I saw the movie. Okay, I was sitting in the Lower East Capitol of Lower East State, one of those massive movie palaces that no longer exist in New York City. The day before it opened, there were 3 other people in the theater, and I was sitting and watching this. And I was like, holy fuck. This is gonna be monstrous. It was huge. I'm watching that fucking ship come over there. But it remains, I mean, I rented the 3rd movie on VHS videotape. That's all, you know, VHS. My phone rang 45 minutes before it ended, and I forgot to go back and see it. Okay? So I'm assuming we won. But I don't care. The material makes me uncomfortable because of its insipid adolescent chastity. Okay, people give me shit for introducing a sexual element to the material I do, and they're welcome to it. The idea is that ignore it, avoid it, but don't pillory me for it. I feel that way about Star Wars. I ignore and avoid it because it is of no interest to me. Okay, sorry, pal. I know you wanted me to be loving.
Didn't expect it.
Good call. Thanks.
I think we're about out
I
of
do
time.
too. Thank you so much for your attention. I cannot tell you how grateful I am. This is more than I could have ever anticipated or expected, and that's no shit. I take nothing for granted. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You have a super chicken.
I beg your pardon?
You have a super chicken.
When you find yourself in danger, when you're threatened by a stranger, when it looks like you will take a licking, when there's no one else to turn to, there is something you should learn to call for Super Chicken. And Fred, if you're afraid you'll have to overlook it, well, you knew the job was dangerous when you took it. He will drink his super sauce and throw the bad guys for a loss, and he will bring them in alive and kicking. When there's no one else to turn to, there is something else to learn to call for Super Chicken. Thank you.